Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Tonight we're traveling back to 1918 New Orleans, where a shadowy figure terrorized the city with a series of brutal attacks that would become legend. Known as the Axeman, this mysterious killer broke into homes using nothing but a chisel, turning victims' own axes against them in the dead of night. But what makes this case truly extraordinary is how an entire city united against the terror through the power of jazz music. When the killer promised to spare any home playing jazz on one fateful night, New Orleans transformed into one massive concert of defiance. Join me as we unravel the haunting mystery of the Axeman of New Orleans. In the sultry spring of 1918, New Orleans was a city alive with the sounds of jazz and the scent of magnolia blossoms. But beneath this vibrant exterior, a shadow was beginning to fall across the crescent city. The first attack came on a warm May evening when an Italian grocer and his wife were attacked in their home on Magnolia Street. The assailant had carefully removed a panel from their back door, slipped inside, and used their own axe to commit the brutal assault. Miraculously, both survived, but this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most terrifying chapters in New Orleans history. The pattern quickly became clear. The perpetrator, who would come to be known as the Axeman, seemed to have a methodical approach. He would chisel out panels from doors or windows, creating an entrance just large enough for a person to slip through. Most chilling of all, he never brought his own weapon. Instead, he would use the victim's own axes, which he would find in their homes or yards. This signature would become his calling card, a psychological torment that turned the simple tools of daily life into objects of terror. As summer progressed into fall, the attacks continued. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were not as fortunate as the first victims. On the night of May 23, 1918, the Axemen struck their home on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. Joseph's brother Jake, who lived next door, discovered their bodies the following morning. Catherine's throat had been cut with a razor, while both victims showed evidence of brutal axe wounds. The razor belonged to Joseph's brother Andrew, who operated a barber shop nearby. Though Andrew was initially suspected, he was quickly cleared, and the killer's true identity remained a mystery. The city was gripped by fear, but there was something else too, a growing fascination with the killer's methodology. The precision of his entries, the use of victims' own weapons, and his ability to move through the city unseen sparked wild theories. Some believed he was supernatural, able to transform himself into mist, to slip through the tiny holes he carved in doors. Others were convinced he was a demon, sent to punish the wicked. These theories were fueled by the fact that many of his victims were Italian grocers, leading to speculation about organized crime connections or ethnic targeting. The police were baffled. Inspector William D'Antonio led the investigation, but every lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. The crime scenes were remarkably clean, save for the horrific violence inflicted upon the victims. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern to the timing of the attacks. Just the haunting signature of the chiseled panels and the victims' own axes turned against them. As 1918 drew to a close, the attacks seemed to subside, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. But this was merely the eye of the storm. In March 1919, the Axeman would return with a theatrical flourish that would cement his place in criminal history. A letter arrived at local newspapers, written in a grandiose style that matched the audacity of his crimes. "They have never caught me, and they never will," the letter boasted. "I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." The writer claimed to be fond of jazz music and made an extraordinary promise. On the night of March 19th, he would spare any home where jazz was playing. "One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The response to this letter transformed New Orleans into a surreal scene of defiance and celebration. On the appointed night, the city erupted in what could only be described as a massive jazz party. Every home and establishment that could produce music did so. Piano players' fingers flew across keyboards, trumpets blared from balconies, and even those who couldn't play an instrument had phonographs cranked to full volume. The streets were filled with the sounds of jazz mixing and mingling in a cacophonous symphony of survival. The killer kept his word. No one died that night. But this theatrical interlude only deepened the mystery. Was the letter genuine, or was it the work of someone exploiting the city's fear? The writing style was distinctive, with a mix of educated vocabulary and theatrical flair that suggested someone of intelligence and dramatic inclination. Handwriting experts pored over the letter, but like everything else about the Axeman, it yielded no conclusive evidence. The investigation continued to pursue various theories. Some suspected the killings were connected to the Black Hand, an extortion racket that targeted Italian immigrants. Others believed the Axeman was a disgruntled former employee of one of the grocers, or perhaps a competitor in the grocery business. Each theory seemed plausible until examined closely, at which point it would fall apart under the weight of contradictory evidence. The attacks continued sporadically through 1919, each one following the same pattern: the chiseled entry, the use of the victim's own axes, the seemingly random selection of targets. The city remained in a state of heightened anxiety, with residents taking extraordinary precautions. Many slept with axes locked away, while others kept vigil through the night, weapons at the ready. The sound of jazz became both a comfort and a reminder of the terror that stalked their streets. The summer of 1919 brought a stifling heat to New Orleans, and with it came more attacks. On August 10th, Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were attacked in their home in Gretna, just across the Mississippi River. The scene was particularly horrific. Rosie survived despite severe head wounds, but Charles and little Mary did not. In her initial statements to police, Rosie accused her neighbors, but later recanted, adding another layer of confusion to an already complex investigation. What made the Cortimiglia case especially disturbing was the killer's willingness to attack a child. Previous victims had all been adults, and this escalation suggested either a growing bloodlust or, perhaps more terrifyingly, that the Axeman's pattern was beginning to break down. Criminal psychologists of the era, though still in the early stages of their field, suggested that this might indicate the killer was losing control, becoming more erratic and dangerous. The investigation took another bizarre turn when local occultists began offering their theories. New Orleans had long been a center for voodoo and other spiritual practices, and several self-proclaimed psychics came forward with visions of the killer. One claimed the Axeman was a tall man with a dark beard who wore a black slouch hat and carried a black bag. Another insisted he was a supernatural entity that could only be stopped by specific rituals. While the police officially dismissed these claims, the public's imagination was captured by these supernatural explanations. The city's Italian community was particularly affected by the reign of terror. Many of the victims had been Italian grocers, and some began to close their shops early or abandon their businesses altogether. The community had already faced discrimination and violence, including the infamous 1891 lynching of 11 Italian Americans, and the Axeman's apparent targeting of Italian victims reopened old wounds and suspicions. Local newspapers continued to sensationalize the stories, with headlines growing more lurid with each attack. The Times-Picayune ran detailed accounts of each crime scene, often embellishing the facts with dramatic flourishes. This media coverage had an unintended effect. It began to inspire copycats. Several attacks were initially attributed to the Axeman, but were later revealed to be the work of opportunistic criminals trying to disguise their crimes as the work of the infamous killer. By late 1919, the attacks began to take on a different character. Some victims reported hearing footsteps in their homes, but finding no one. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving in impossible ways. Whether these incidents were genuine encounters with the Axeman or the product of frayed nerves and mounting hysteria became impossible to determine. The line between fact and fiction, already blurred by the killer's theatrical letter and the jazz night spectacle, became increasingly indistinct. The police investigation, meanwhile, continued to pursue every possible lead. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, tracked down countless tips, and even brought in experts from other cities to consult on the case. One detective developed a theory that the killer might be a carpenter or someone skilled in woodwork, based on the precise nature of the chiseled panels. Another suggested the Axeman might be a musician, given his apparent appreciation for jazz. But each new theory, no matter how promising initially, eventually led to another dead end. The social fabric of New Orleans began to change in response to the threat. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked now installed multiple locks and bars. Communities organized watch groups, with men taking turns patrolling their streets at night. The sound of jazz, once simply the soundtrack of city life, took on new significance. Some continued to play it nightly, believing it might still offer protection, while others came to associate it with the terror of that strange night in March when the whole city had danced to the tune of a killer's whim. As 1919 drew to a close, the attacks gradually became less frequent, but the fear remained. The last confirmed attack attributed to the Axeman occurred in October 1919, though some researchers argue that similar attacks continued into the early 1920s. The killer's true identity remained a mystery, and the case officially went cold, joining the pantheon of New Orleans' unsolved mysteries. The investigation's files grew thick with potential suspects, but thin on concrete evidence. One compelling theory centered on Joseph Momfrey, a man shot to death in Los Angeles in 1920 by the widow of one of the Axeman's alleged victims. While this story has been repeated in various accounts, modern researchers have found little evidence to support it, and the connection remains speculative at best. The Axeman's reign of terror fundamentally changed New Orleans. The city that had prided itself on its relaxed, easygoing atmosphere became more cautious, more suspicious. The case highlighted the limitations of early 20th century police work and the power of media sensationalism to shape public perception. It also demonstrated how a community could come together in the face of terror, as evidenced by the jazz night response to the killer's letter. The legacy of the Axeman extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of his crimes. In the decades that followed, his story became intertwined with the broader cultural fabric of New Orleans, a dark thread in the tapestry of the city's rich history. Criminologists and historians continue to study the case, finding in it elements that would influence the investigation of serial killers for generations to come. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case was how it reflected the social dynamics of its time. The targeting of Italian grocers highlighted the ethnic tensions that existed in early 20th century New Orleans. Many Italian immigrants had established successful small businesses, particularly grocery stores, which sometimes led to resentment from other communities. The Axeman's apparent focus on these establishments added a layer of racial and social complexity to an already mysterious case. The jazz connection remains perhaps the most fascinating element of the entire saga. The night of March 19, 1919, when the entire city played jazz to ward off the killer, represented a unique moment in criminal history where fear and cultural expression intersected in an unprecedented way. This event had lasting repercussions on the city's musical heritage. Several jazz compositions were inspired by the Axeman, including the Axeman's Jazz, which became a popular tune in local dance halls. The incident helped cement New Orleans' reputation as a city where music wasn't just entertainment, it was a form of protection, a shield against darkness, a communal response to terror. Modern criminal profilers who have studied the case suggest that the Axeman displayed characteristics that would later become recognized as common traits among serial killers. His methodical approach, the ritualistic aspects of his crimes, and his communication with the media all fit patterns that would be identified in later decades. The letter to the newspapers, with its grandiose style and theatrical threats, presaged similar communications from future killers like the Zodiac or the Son of Sam. The investigation's failures also proved instructive for law enforcement. The lack of forensic techniques in 1918-1919 severely hampered the police's efforts, but even basic investigative procedures were sometimes neglected. Crime scenes were not properly secured, evidence was contaminated or lost, and witness statements were not always thoroughly cross-referenced. These mistakes would later serve as object lessons for police departments developing modern investigative protocols. Some researchers have suggested that the Axeman's crimes might have extended beyond the commonly accepted timeline. Similar attacks were reported in surrounding parishes and even in other parts of Louisiana during the same period. While these connections were never proven, they raise the possibility that the Axeman's reign of terror might have been more extensive than originally thought. The difficulty in connecting these crimes highlights another challenge of early 20th century law enforcement, the lack of communication and coordination between different jurisdictions. The psychological impact on the city's residents was profound and long-lasting. Many families passed down stories of that era, tales of sleeping in shifts and keeping axes locked away in specially built boxes. Some homes built in the years following the Axeman spree featured unusual security measures, extra thick doors, reinforced windows, and elaborate locking mechanisms. These architectural adaptations served as physical reminders of the period's climate of fear. The media's role in the case has been extensively analysed by journalism historians. The sensational coverage, while problematic from a modern perspective, provides valuable insights into early 20th century journalism and its influence on public perception. The newspaper's lurid descriptions and dramatic headlines both reflected and amplified the public's fears, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and speculation that may have complicated the investigation. The Axeman case also influenced the development of criminal psychology. The killer's apparent ritualistic behaviors, the careful removal of door panels, the use of victims' own weapons, suggested a complex psychological profile that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior. The case became a subject of study for early forensic psychiatrists who sought to understand the mind behind these methodical yet brutal crimes. One enduring mystery is the Axeman's apparent cessation of activities. While some serial killers are caught or killed, others simply stop, leaving investigators to wonder about their fate. In the Axeman's case, the gradual tapering off of attacks has led to numerous theories. Did he die? Move away? Was he imprisoned for another crime? The lack of closure has contributed to the case's lasting intrigue. The story of the Axeman has become part of New Orleans' darker tourism industry, joining the tales of vampires, voodoo queens, and haunted mansions that attract visitors to the city. Ghost tours often include stops at locations associated with the killings, and the case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and even theatrical productions. This commercialization of tragedy reflects how communities process and memorialize traumatic events over time. Perhaps most significantly, the Axeman case demonstrates how unsolved crimes can shape a city's collective memory and cultural identity. The mystery became part of New Orleans mythology, a reminder that beneath the city's celebratory surface lurks a deeper, darker history. The case continues to resonate because it combines elements that remain relevant today: the fear of random violence, the power of media influence, the role of music in community resilience, and the complex interplay of race, ethnicity, and crime. As New Orleans entered the 1920s, the Axeman faded into history, but his influence persisted. The case represented more than just a series of unsolved crimes. It was a watershed moment that changed how the city saw itself and how it would face future challenges. The jazz-filled night of defiance became a symbol of New Orleans' spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, communities can find ways to stand together against fear. Today, more than a century later, the Axeman's true identity remains unknown, but his impact on New Orleans' history, culture, and collective psyche is undeniable. The case continues to fascinate new generations of true crime enthusiasts, historians, and social scientists, each finding in it new lessons about crime, media, society, and the complex ways communities respond to terror in their midst.